The girl was sitting on a tree thinking about life, when she suddenly heard a series of chirping sounds coming from beneath her. She leaned down to look under the tree, and to her surprise she discovered a nest of abandoned wild goose eggs. She instinctively reached out to pick them up, but faint chirping came from inside the wild goose eggs again, as if the little ones were calling for help. Considering that the nearby area had just been damaged by humans and the wild geese had lost their home, she hurried back home, rummaged through the storage room to find a backpack, and carefully gathered all the scattered wild goose eggs until the straps were completely filled. After returning home, she placed the eggs into a drawer, wrapped them gently with soft clothes to keep them warm, and while her father was focused on metalwork, she secretly took a light bulb and placed it inside the drawer to create a simple incubator. The next day at school, Amy could not focus on her classes at all, because her mind was completely occupied by the bird eggs hidden in the drawer. At that moment, a new life was quietly breaking through its shell, using all its strength to escape its confinement and bravely enter the world. When Amy returned home after school, even though she was eager to check on them, she waited patiently until the middle of the night to avoid being discovered, then quietly went to the hay room alone. The moment she opened the drawer, a burst of bright light rushed out, followed by the sight of a group of tiny newborn lives waiting to be cared for. Not long after, Amy's father returned home and found that his daughter was missing, so he went out with a flashlight to search for her, and finally found Amy fast asleep in the hay room with a group of fluffy goslings by her side. Seeing such a tender scene, her father could not bring himself to wake her, and gently placed a blanket over her. But just as he was about to leave, Amy suddenly woke up from her dream.
Can I keep him? Please?
Her father agreed to her request without hesitation, but the next morning he was overwhelmed by a table full of bird droppings. With no other choice, he went to the local forest management office to ask for help. The forest officer told him that geese are migratory birds that fly south when autumn comes, but without their parents to guide them, the young geese would get lost in the sky and might be harmed by power lines or vehicles. However, at this stage, they only needed some straw and grain to survive, and because of imprinting, the young geese would treat the first living being they saw after hatching as their parent, which meant Amy had become their mother. From that day on, Amy spent every moment with the goslings, and no matter where she went, a line of adorable little geese followed behind her. Under the glow of the sunset, they wandered joyfully among the flowers like tiny spirits. But the good times did not last long, because a few days later the forest officer arrived at Amy's home to talk about regulations regarding raising geese.
All domestically raised geese have to be rendered flightless. It's better known as pinioning.
After speaking, he reached out to grab one of the goslings and prepared to cut its wings with a nail clipper.
Now what you do is you take the wing and you just shave a bit off the cuticle right here.
Seeing her daughter so traumatized, her father immediately drove the officer out of the house and warned him not to cause trouble again. But the officer refused to give up, and before leaving he issued a threat: if the geese were not clipped within 2 months, they would all be taken away. Faced with the threat, her father ignored it completely and focused only on his daughter's well-being. However, what had just happened made Amy completely lose trust in her father, and she locked herself in the bathroom with the goslings, trembling non-stop, refusing to come out no matter how her father tried to comfort her. And later she even slept in the bathtub to continue resisting him. After all this chaos, her father had no idea what to do, because he never expected a 13-year-old girl to be so headstrong. But all of this had its reasons. Not long ago, Amy had experienced a car accident. That day she went out with her mother, and just as they were about to arrive, her mother answered a phone call, and a large truck drove toward them. And before she could react, the car hit the guardrail and rolled over several times before stopping. When Amy woke up again, she had already been lying in the hospital for a week. But seeing the father she had not seen for 10 years sitting by her side made her feel confused.
Why are you here?
I came down from Canada. I've come to take you home.
After hearing her father's explanation, Amy more or less understood the situation.
Mum died, didn't she?
1 month later, she followed her father back home. This was where she had lived as a child. But the moment she stepped inside, she was stunned by the sight before her. The living room was filled with sculptures of all kinds, and the floor was cluttered with everything, leaving no place to stand, and even her own room was packed with random objects. This showed how messy her father's life had become, which explained why her mother divorced him. But at that moment, Amy could not think about anything else, because her mother's passing had devastated her, and all she wanted was a place to rest. However, early the next morning, Amy was awakened by loud noises coming from outside, and when she opened the curtains, she saw her father standing on a hill with something strange on his back. It turned out to be a simple aircraft so basic that it did not even have a power system, which made it seem impossible for it to fly. Her father had already climbed to the top of the slope, adjusted the direction of the aircraft, put on professional goggles, and then charged downhill at the perfect moment. Amy originally wanted to laugh at him, but the next second the aircraft actually lifted into the air, and within moments it was soaring nearly 100 meters above the ground. In fact, her father was flying a glider that could take off with nothing but wind. Seeing such an unbelievable scene, Amy ran outside to watch, afraid to miss even a moment. After circling the area a few times, her father finally began his landing, adjusting the angle of the glider as he slowly lowered in altitude, and after a few turns in the air, he successfully touched the ground. After a wild sprint, he ended his landing by hitting the ground face first. Amy stared at him full of worry, and when she saw him lying still, she thought she might become an orphan. At that moment, her father suddenly climbed out of the glider and even raised his arm in triumph toward her. Amy felt her father was acting like a reckless child and grew angry for worrying so much, so she ran back to her room. Watching his daughter rush into her room, her father felt helpless, because he had no idea how to reconnect with the daughter he had not seen for years. So he went back to burying himself in his work. This left Amy incredibly bored, and she wandered around with nothing to do. Although her father's new girlfriend treated her kindly, the place her mother held in her heart could never be replaced. Whenever she felt sad, Amy would climb up to a high place and stare into the distance as if searching for her mother's presence, trying to soothe her loneliness. One early morning, her father was awakened by the roar of machines, and a huge bulldozer was tearing trees out by the roots, causing the wild geese in the forest to scatter. Her father immediately lost all sleepiness, and before even putting on a shirt, he rushed outside angrily and shouted for the machine to stop. But it was pointless, because the bulldozer continued working without pause. Amy had never seen her father so angry, and worried she might be frightened. He stepped back from confronting the bulldozer and returned home to explain everything to her. It turned out that developers wanted to clear the forest, but her father strongly opposed it, because destroying it would damage the ecosystem and leave many animals without shelter. However, Amy remained indifferent, because she had never felt at home here, and whether the forest was protected or destroyed meant nothing to her. So she sat alone on a fallen tree just as she always did, staring blankly ahead. And that was when the scene from the beginning happened. Amy took the eggs home and successfully hatched a group of goslings. As she looked at these fragile little creatures, a mix of emotions filled her heart, because she had just lost her mother, and these baby birds had no mother from the moment they were born, and their presence felt like something nature had arranged on purpose. If these little ones could be raised into adulthood and given the care and warmth they lacked from their mother, perhaps she could gradually heal the wounds in her own heart as well. So after this, Amy became especially attentive to the young birds, and when she saw the forest officer's rough behavior, she completely lost control and even locked herself inside the bathroom, refusing to respond no matter what her apologetic father said outside the door. Looking at the young goslings that had almost been harmed, Amy no longer trusted anyone at that moment, and she even slept directly in the bathtub at night to protect her little ones with her own presence. As time quietly passed, the young goslings grew day by day, and their feathers gradually filled in. Amy dressed herself like a bird mother and took on the responsibility and devotion of being their parent. During this time, her father also noticed that the goslings always followed Amy closely, and he realized that wild geese belong to nature by birth, and migration is an instinct they are born with, and treating them like pets would not only violate the laws of nature but also take away their freedom to soar in the sky. So an idea quietly formed in his mind. Since the young wild geese could follow Amy, then with training they could also follow his aircraft, and this way they could guide the goslings to migrate to a lush wetland for the winter. and when spring arrived the following year, the young geese would naturally return along the same route. When Amy heard this, she felt reluctant, but she also understood it was true, because the young geese were destined to grow up, for their future freedom to fly across the sky. She agreed to her father's suggestion. In the days that followed, the father and daughter began training the young wild geese. At first, no matter how hard her father tried to guide them, the young geese had no interest in him and would not even glance his way. But as time went on, they became familiar with the man who ran around foolishly every day, and they began to chase after him with excitement. And the first stage of training finally showed results. When the young geese grew strong enough to fly, the training entered the flight guidance stage. However, this time they faced a greater challenge. On land, the young geese would still run with her father, but once he took off in the aircraft, they would stop in place and refuse to move. Amy believed the young geese were too attached to her and did not want to leave. So when the next flight began, she quickly hid in the nearby bushes, but the young geese still managed to find her accurately. And although the training seemed perfect, the results did not go as planned, which left her father deeply discouraged. Just when they were feeling disheartened, the roar of an aircraft came from above. It turned out that Amy believed only she could lead the young geese into the air, so she took off alone behind her father's back and soared into the blue sky. And just as she expected, when the young geese saw Amy take off, they flapped their wings and followed after her. However, Amy was still just a child, and her father had never allowed her to operate the aircraft. So after a series of panicked movements, she lost control and crashed downward. Her father rushed over to check on her, and fortunately Amy was only frightened and was not seriously hurt.
Are you hurt?
I don't think so. You're crying.
Yeah, I thought you were.
At that moment, a long-lost warmth rose in Amy's heart, and the final distance between father and daughter quietly disappeared. Although this flight ended in failure, her father saw a glimmer of hope in it, because the young wild geese's trust and willingness to follow Amy might be the key to completing this migration. He decided to build a small aircraft so the young geese could follow Amy, and Amy could follow him. Unexpectedly, Amy, who was hiding in the attic, happily accepted the suggestion when she heard it. However, Amy was small and struggled to control a heavy aircraft, so she needed a lighter and easier-to-handle flying machine. For his daughter's safety, her father sold the lunar lander model he had treasured for years and used the money to customize a bird-shaped aircraft designed like a wild goose, then personally taught Amy how to turn, take off, and land. Amy was very smart and learned quickly, and in a short time she could operate it with ease. When she flew the aircraft alone into the sky for the first time, a miracle happened. The wild geese that had been kept in captivity became restless, and their eyes followed Amy's silhouette as if they felt her call. They packed open the straps on the cage, rushed out in a scramble, and spread their wings as they flew toward their bird mother in the sky. Under the blue sky, two gliders flew side by side, and in the middle was a line of wild geese, forming a beautiful arc as they flew in perfect formation. And the test flight mission was finally a success. Next, they needed to find an ideal habitat for the wild geese, and it happened that a friend nearby knew a bird expert in North Carolina who had deep knowledge of migration routes. Although he scoffed at the idea of guiding wild geese with aircraft, he still helped them find a lush and beautiful wetland suitable as a winter home for the geese. In recent years, the number of migratory birds wintering there had been decreasing, and the wetland had already been targeted by developers. And if no migratory birds arrived before November 1st, they would take over the land. It now seemed that this journey was not only a migration to the south but also a battle to protect nature. With the destination confirmed, they needed to create a more detailed plan. Their route began at a farm in Canada, crossed the shimmering waters of Lake Ontario, passed over the majestic Appalachian Mountains, then flew across the skies of New York, and finally reached the Potomac River, covering 500 miles over about 3 days. These wild geese had grown up under Amy's care and had never experienced high-intensity flight training. To prepare for the long journey ahead, they needed to reduce the geese's weight in a short time and increase the intensity of their flight training. So Amy began a grueling training program for the wild geese, leading them in continuous circles in the sky and pushing them to their limits again and again. Everything was ready, and to arrive before November 1st, they would need to depart early the next morning. That night, however, the forest officers took advantage of the darkness to capture all the wild geese and lock them inside cages. In order to depart on time according to their plan, they came up with a bold rescue operation. Amy and her father waited in the aircraft ready to take off. Her father's friend disguised himself and went to the front desk to report an unidentified creature to distract the guard, and a neighbor slipped inside to release the captured wild geese and drive them toward the lake. At that moment, Amy happened to fly past in the aircraft and naturally guided the wild geese into the sky. They flew over neatly arranged villages, crossed the endless surface of the sea, and traveled from the first light of morning into the darkness of night. And the wild geese grew exhausted while the aircraft fuel was almost depleted. At that moment, they approached a United States Air Force base, and the radar detected an unidentified flying object heading toward the facility. With past attack incidents in mind, the base treated it as a high-alert situation and prepared to dispatch fighter jets to intercept. However, before the fighter jets could take off, her father landed safely with Amy on the runway. But the moment they touched down, they were immediately surrounded by armed soldiers and forcefully pushed to the ground. Fortunately, the commanding officer did not give them a hard time, because he quickly realized that this was a rare opportunity for positive publicity. So he gathered the soldiers and warmly took photos with the father, the daughter, and the wild geese. The next day their story became headline news, and the general personally led the team to see them off, carrying the hopes of countless people. Amy and her father led the wild geese into the sky once again. They gracefully passed over quiet countryside towns, flew over colorful open fields, and swept across hills covered in gold, painting a magnificent and stirring picture across the land. But at that moment, a gunshot suddenly echoed from afar and shattered the peaceful scene, and the wild geese were frightened into scattering in all directions. It turned out to be a group of hunters waiting for the migration season, lying in ambush to satisfy their appetite by shooting migratory birds. Worried that the wild geese would be harmed, the brave Amy flew her aircraft toward them, and the hunters were startled by the sudden appearance of the large aircraft and hurriedly fled, allowing the wild geese to land safely on the lake to rest. The father and daughter chose to land their aircraft in a nearby field, and as they walked out of the woods, an elderly woman holding a shotgun blocked their path, mistaking them for poachers attempting to harm the wild geese. But the elderly woman quickly recognized Amy. That evening, she warmly invited them to have dinner at her home, and the television was filled with reports about their journey. During that meal, Amy ate with exceptional joy. Early the next morning, under the golden glow of sunrise, two small aircraft carried a line of wild geese into the sky once again. Their story captured the attention of media around the world, and the destination was already filled with cameras and reporters preparing to witness this historic moment. And countless people moved by the courage, kindness, and bond of the father and daughter gathered to cheer for them. At that moment, the father and daughter led the wild geese through layers of mist and arrived in the skies above a city filled with tall buildings, weaving freely through the narrow streets as people below stopped their busy work to look up. Sunlight reflected off the silver wings and cast dazzling halos, and the wild geese flapped their wings with all their strength as they followed Amy forward. But then her father's aircraft malfunctioned and suddenly plummeted from the sky, and Amy hurriedly descended to rush toward him.
Dad! Dad! Daddy!
Ah, damn.
Are you okay?
Fortunately, her father had only dislocated his shoulder and was not seriously injured, but he could no longer continue flying the aircraft. Therefore, the remaining 10 kilometers had to be completed by Amy alone.
She went off, followed her dream. Nobody helped her. You've got that strength in you too, Amy.
I wish she was here now.
She is. She's right next to you. She's in the geese. She's in the sky. She's all around you.
If she could not arrive before sunset, the last remaining sanctuary for migratory birds would be replaced by the developer's buildings. Her father's encouragement strengthened Amy's resolve to push forward with courage. She soared into the sky again and flew through crowded city streets, where pedestrians stopped to guide her in the right direction. Meanwhile, because Amy had not yet arrived, the developers were preparing to begin construction, and the bulldozers had already started moving forward as bird lovers stood in front of them in desperate resistance. And the moment Amy led the wild geese into view, The crowd erupted into thunderous cheers, and people spontaneously cleared a runway for the aircraft as the wild geese descended onto the lake to rest and play. The crowd surged toward Amy like a rising tide, shouting her name together and making her the center of attention. This journey was not only a migration of life, but also a rebirth of family bonds. Ever since her father's aircraft crash, his words "you must keep going" helped Amy understand that growing up means learning to fly on one's own. But love and companionship are always the wind beneath one's wings. The land is vast and the sky is wide, and the most moving journey is never a lonely one but one flown together with love.